welcome to the session, which is entitled Water, Water Everywhere, Not Allowed to Use It. I'm Craig Fairnington. I'm Online Resources Manager at the Institute of Ideas. You may remember earlier this year the months of rain we had, which almost immediately followed a declaration of a hosepipe ban down here in England, which obviously kind of led to catchy newspaper images of season umbrellas in front of drought warnings. And it kind of resulted in a bit of resentment from people who were drenched to the bone, yet banned from using their hosepipes. Of course, the reality of that situation is much different. And worldwide, water shortages don't just mean a hosepipe ban. It can be a situation of life and death. So there's lots of things to explore here. And I'm glad to have with me some great people to explore it with. On my far right, we have David Lloyd Owen, who's Managing Director at Leakage. Yes. And he's author of Sound of Thirst, which is a really fantastic book. Next to him, and nearest to me, we have Andy Wales, who's a Senior Vice President of Sustainable Development at SAB Miller, who are one of our debate partners for this session. To my left, we have Caspar Hewett, who's a Water Resources Environment Consultant and a Director of the Great Debate. Furthest left, we have Chris Binnie, who's an independent water consultant. He's a member of the ICE Water Expert Panel, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineers, who are another of our debate partners for this session.
2012 in Britain has been characterised by drought and flood. I would say it's a case of, for Britain, a drought, a political will to take water seriously. For the world, a drought of management capability. For Britain, we've had a flood of misinformation and misunderstanding about what water priorities are. And outside, in the world beyond, there's been a flood of ignorance. How did we get to this? Well, let's just take a look back for Britain at first. In 1989, in England and Wales, the water sector was privatised. It was said at the time that it would cost between 16 and 18 billion pounds to bring Britain's water infrastructure up to scratch. I was forecasting at the time it'd be close to 30 to 35. In fact, in the first 20 years since privatisation, 92 billion pounds has been spent dealing with various infrastructure issues, and another 90 to 95 billion pounds has to be spent in the next 20 years. And yet, we don't really get the impression that the water sector is particularly in good shape in Britain. We're still highly vulnerable to events like flood, events like droughts, and public perception remains challenging. Those first 20 years were really about catch-up of decades of neglect and getting to understand European legislation. The next few decades will be about improvising and implementing European legislation and coming up with the challenge of demographic and climate change. So, it's not a very easy market to be in, neither for the customer, the environment, or the companies themselves. Globally, we were told earlier this year that the Millennium Development Goal for water, that is, to halve the number of people without access to improved water, had been met in 2010. I wish that was the case. Officially, people get terribly excited because 700 million people don't have access to improved drinking water. In reality, between 1.8 and 3.5 billion, in other words, half the world's population, doesn't have access to safe drinking water. At least 2.6 billion don't have access to safe sanitation. In Kenya and in India, more people have access to a mobile phone than have tap water. So something is not quite right here. And looking at sanitation, no, I'm afraid the 2015 target of halving the number without access to sanitation was not met last year. It is on course to be met in 2080, which is not terribly encouraging. coming home. In southeast England, we are addressing an existential water crisis. 41% of all water which hits the ground in southeast England is already being used. We are officially a desert. There's less water per capita in southeast England than there is in Syria or Egypt. But we operate on the mentality of being a water-rich country. Half of this is a problem of perception. Politicians are utterly scared to address water issues, to take water seriously. To give you an example, our Water Minister, Richard Benyon, who by any accounts is a solid, decent chap, but discussing metering with him, he said, well, what about the chances of universal metering? And he told me, I'm afraid we can't have universal metering. You see, poor families can't afford it, which is extraordinary because we have universal metering in Kampala, we have universal metering in Phnom Penh, but Britain is too poor. Maybe I'm a bit ignorant here, but I thought the average Briton is slightly wealthier than the average Ugandan, but not in the eyes of a politician. That is the level of political debate and political engagement we have to deal with. Yet, while in England and Wales, the average person consumes 140 to 150 litres of water per person per day, in southeast England, there's one water company where it's between 115 and 125. Why? Metering, tariffs, simply that they have been allowed, almost by an accident of history, to take water seriously. And taking a global corollary, the government of Singapore has announced a plan to be water self-sufficient by 2060 by looking at the country as an integrated water resource. What can be done with political will. Now, there were actually more ambitious proposals to deal with the water problem. In 2003, the World Water Vision was launched to make sure that everybody had access to safe water, safe sanitation by 2025. Unfortunately, the launch never took place because the process at the World Water Forum, where water finance was just going to be discussed, was physically broken up by demonstrators. And so the entire launch was abandoned. Why were they demonstrating? Because they believe that all water should be free and that it's an absolute human right to have free water and no form of public involvement whatsoever, and no form of finance should be allowed to pollute water, which is wonderful. And I agree, free water is a lovely idea. So is free cholera, so is free dysentery, so is free yellow fever. So that is the level of political engagement we have to deal with. So how can we go on? I'm just giving a few general points here, but I would say, can we move on by taking the case of what's happening in Singapore? There, when you go to a conference, the Prime Minister of Singapore will turn up without notes and speak for an hour about water policy. It's rather embarrassing. They have fair water pricing for all. Industry, customers, everybody pays a sensible full cost recovery price for water, an affordable price. Those in poor families, of course, do get subsidies. But what they did first, they had good service for everybody. Then they started making more exciting things through a political consensus, through using the private sector only when the private sector has something to offer, using the government only when the government has something to offer. So nothing is ruled out. The only thing they're interested in is water efficiency and self-sufficiency. What Singapore has done is not exceptional. We must make it the norm. Thank you.
Fab, thank you. And just to give you some context, I work for SAB Miller. We make beer in about 70 countries around the world, and also some soft drinks. And I actually used to work in the water sector and then went to a kind of higher value purpose. I wanted to, I guess, make three short points, basically. The first is that water underpins growth around the world. A lot of the work that looks at water risk around the world, if you aggregate it, shows that by about 2030, water demand will be 40% higher than water supply. Now, that's quite a big challenge for a business like ours that depends significantly on emerging market growth. And of course, it's a big challenge for consumers in those markets, citizens who are looking for a higher quality of life. And the principal driver for that is, to an extent, population growth, but largely the improvement of wealth. The fact that we've got about 2 billion people who are defined as middle class around the world now, and by 2030, there will be about 5 billion people. People who, like you and I, can maybe have a coffee at the start of the day, or if we choose to, eat meat a couple of times a week, and do other things that are actually in the supply chain quite water intensive. And first of all, that growth of the middle class is something that we should celebrate. Particularly, as I guess I class myself as an environmentalist, and too many of us are often miserable about growth. But actually, the opportunities that brings to another 3 billion people to have a much higher quality of life is fantastic. But we can't do it, we can't get there without significant changes in how value chains work and how resources like water are used in value chains. And that's not always, though, a negative challenge. So if you look at the water gap for 2030 for South Africa is about 17%, or up to 30% if you look at some of the climate change scenarios, if you include those. South Africa can bridge that water gap and save $120 million at the society level every year if business and agriculture, farmers and government work together in an integrated way to tackle that challenge. So water underpins growth, and if we don't get water right in different parts of society, we're not going to get that growth. Getting that growth is challenged because water is a rather dreary subject. The water ministry, the environment ministry, isn't normally the top job in any cabinet, and it's not often the top role if you're coming out of university. Actually, there's a whole range of issues and challenges, and you can see them debated at the weekend here, that attract more people than the water issue. But what we need to understand is water doesn't just sit on its own. Water is intricately connected to what we might perceive as bigger issues like food and energy. And in fact, the way it's often connected at the moment is by considering the water, food, energy nexus. The fact that you can't set policy, you can't run a business by looking at those resources separately. Actually, we need to look at them in an integrated way. And that's obviously if you look at some of the stats. Agriculture uses 70% of water around the world, and agriculture is also one of the biggest polluters of water. Energy uses a huge amount of water. Something like 50% of US fresh water is used in some way in electricity generation in the US. And of course, the water industry itself uses a huge amount of energy. In the UK, something like, I think, 6% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the water sector. Pretty much the same as aviation, although you don't often hear it. And actually, of course, they all come together in the delightful subject of biofuels, which has been in the press this week, where a potential renewable energy source is hugely intensive in many ways, including its use of water. And so we need to think about these things in a connected way. And it's amazing how people don't. I was at a session, chairing a session in the Latin America Economic Summit in Mexico earlier this year, and we had the agriculture minister from Mexico giving his 2020 vision for agriculture in Mexico, and the head of the state water company in Mexico giving the 2020 vision for water. Utterly unconnected. And yet these resources need to be managed together. And in fact, post that session and with some work with the World Economic Forum, that's really moving forward. So water underpins growth, but it needs to be connected to particularly food and energy through how we think about the water, food, energy nexus. But we'll only get there if we value water properly. And one of the big reasons that water isn't considered in these conversations as effectively as it needs to be is because it's so chronically undervalued around the world. It's partly because we don't understand the flows. The fact that as a water user in London, in the southeast of the UK, as David says, you might use 125 litres of water per day for your daily washing and cleaning and using the loo. But your total water footprint might be more like 4,600 litres of water per day if you take data from people like WWF, because of the water used to grow the cotton in your shirt or the food that you eat or even the beer that you drink. And in fact, if you're an average UK cotton wearer, your daily cotton footprint is 220 litres of water per person per day, more than your actual water consumption. Now, footprints are great concepts for awareness and terrible concepts for leading to action, because they can actually be misleading. Because, of course, you could be buying a product that uses lots of water and is made in a part of the world, but they do have lots of water, so it's no problem. Equally, you could be using a product like a cotton shirt, where the crop is grown in a very water-scarce area, perhaps in Egypt or parts of Pakistan, and actually be having a significant impact on water scarcity. And how do we bring that together in the context of global trade? One of the key things there is being able to properly price water, particularly for its use in agriculture. And I'm saying that as representing a company that buys a huge amount of agricultural raw materials every year, because we recognize that for water to be better managed, actually it needs to be more properly priced. And what's more likely is actually that proper pricing of water will lead to dramatic efficiency changes rather than leading to a much bigger increase in my price of water. So water underpins growth. We need to think of it in a connected way, but it needs to be properly priced. I guess one of the big debates we have when we think about water pricing is the similar issue to metering about its potential impact on the poor. And that's why it's so politically difficult. And, you know, I've had conversations with ministers from South Africa, Tanzania, many other places about water pricing. And it's an incredibly difficult political issue that they're very open about it. And so in a way, we can't actually rely on better pricing. We need to push it, but we can't rely on it. And that's where we need to also look at other solutions. And one of the things that we do as a business is a lot of extensive watershed protection partnerships. Not philanthropic, but to protect the growth of our business in the future, recognizing that we can't grow as a company that uses lots of water if communities don't have access to water and if ecology is not protected. And that's where we work with organizations like WWF, with the German government and many others around the world, to find ways that we can seek to protect watersheds in quite innovative ways, often paying farmers to use their land better so they don't pollute water so much, working with all sorts of different industries for us together to cut our water use so that we can find interventions that actually begin to tackle that water challenge. Thank you.
Okay, I was looking at the title of this session, Water, Water Everywhere, Not Allowed to Use It, and correspondence with the other panellists, maybe decide to focus on demand management today. I know that David, Lloyd, Owen and Chris Binnie are both advocates of demand management, and it does have its place. I'm not against metering per se, nor do I think access to water is a right. But the demand management paradigm, which has dominated thinking about water and other resources for 15 years or more, is deeply problematic. It actively holds back development, both here and even worse in the developing world. And it's also part of two wider trends that I reject absolutely. One is to view all resources in terms of limits, and the other is a general critique of consumption, which is twinned with a new moral push to alter our behaviour. Yet water is the one resource that can never run out. It's infinitely recyclable. We have the hydrological cycle. And it's already clean when it falls back to Earth. There's all the more reason to catch it, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. Yet there's major resistance to doing so. So I throw the question out, what is wrong with supply management? The UK is a water-rich country. It's not just a perception. I see no reason to not build for future, more plentiful supply. I also wanted to say a little bit about the unexpected benefits of large engineering water projects. And I'm going to talk about two examples, one from 150 years ago and one from 30. The first is the London sewer system, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It was designed by Sir Joseph Bazalgette. And the project was a response to two cholera epidemics, which killed 25,000 odd people, and the famous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames smelt so bad they had to close the House of Commons, which of course is when Parliament decided to act. Now Bazalgette, he proposed an enclosed sewer system, and at huge expense his plans were implemented, and in a staggeringly short 17 years, London's core sewage system was built. It included 75 miles of main sewers, 1,000 miles of street sewers, and 4 major pumping stations. But the best bit about this example is Bazalgette's immense foresight, which has continued to benefit the people of London to the present day. He designed sewers that were twice the diameter that he calculated were actually needed from a pragmatic point of view that, and these are his words, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen. So he actually put in a factor of 4 in terms of volume that those sewers could take. I like the factor 4 bit because there's a book called Factor 4, but we'll come back to that. But he was right. This larger diameter was able to cope with a huge increase in population density in London after the Second World War. Now, the other example I want to look at is Kielder Water, which is in the northeast of England, which is where I live. It's Northern Europe's largest man-made lake, and it holds 200 billion litres of water. It's the last large reservoir to have been built in the UK, and it was completed 30 years ago. A shockingly long time ago, actually. It provides plentiful, good quality water to the northeast, but it's also a resource people use in all sorts of other ways. They walk and cycle there are lodges there where people holiday, they do water sports, horse ride, enjoy the wildlife. It's a great resource. Was it over-designed? I've had it argued that it was. I got criticised recently at another conference for using it as an example because it was seen as having been over-designed and was seen as a failure. I would argue that it wasn't at all. And in fact, recent developments seem to underline that because in fact it's going to attract new industry to the northeast now because we actually have that resource. Now, contrast that with the recent Thames Water debacle. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in 2006, Thames Water proposed building a new reservoir near Abingdon in Oxfordshire to hold 150,000 megalitres of water to deal with the projected population of London, of the London area of 12 million, and plans for building 200,000 new homes for the region. And there was huge resistance to the plan. The UK Rivers Network wrote a position statement on why they opposed the plans. Their criticisms included the fact that the exact number of new homes to be built was unknown. Thus, the case for large new sources of supply was unproven. So it was unreasonable to attempt to meet projected demand. And I quote, "Detailed plans for reducing demand have not been outlined." And this is the best one, another quote, "Our suspicion is that Thames views the possibility of greater demand for water as a chance to make even more profit out of even more customers. The proposal for a new reservoir near Abingdon is primarily a way for Thames to make more money. It's unsustainable, undesirable, and unnecessary." Hardly an objective critique, yet fairly typical of the response to these sorts of plans. Other objections included the fact that the reservoir may have an effect on birds from the RSPB, and from the CPRE, the reservoir would change the way the area looked. Now, ultimately, the critics of the plans won. In March 2009, Thames Water announced that it was significantly downscaling its plans and putting back the start date of construction by 5 years. Now, in their response to the public consultation, Thames Water noted a substantial reduction in forecast consumption from today's 157 litres per head per day to 135 by 2035, and referred to, again a quote, "improved understanding of customers' reduced water consumption following the drought." They also cited reducing demand through a water efficiency programme that offers practical advice to customers and increased metering in the reasons for their revised plans. So, uncertainty over building in the next 10 years, projected reductions in water consumption based on what happened in a drought, and measures to force people to use less water combined to halt the building of the only large new reservoir planned for the UK. This is typical and unacceptable. We need to reject this way of thinking and plan for the future, for more people, more industry, and thus greater water consumption. Infrastructure is the key. We need a serious commitment to water storage and supply. And that means reservoirs at all scales, large ones, small ones, whatever's appropriate for a particular area. We need a complete overhaul of the pipe network. We're still relying on what the Victorians built. And a willingness to consider desalination at selected locations as well. And this is true internationally as well as in the UK, or focused on the UK. So in summary then, water is not limited in the same way as any other resource. We should reject the idea of reducing consumption in favour of a will to provide more water. And this means reclaiming supply management as a major component of our approach to water.
Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about some of the aspects of the English public water supply system. And in particular, I'm going to look at some of the water resource management plans which project forward about 25 years. I'll ask a number of questions of my colleagues and of you. Now, many water resources in the south and east of England are actually already over-abstracted or over-licensed. And in fact, during the recent drought, you saw a number of pictures of dried-up riverbeds. Now, the Water Framework Directive requires us to have good ecological status in all our rivers. And to do that, we need to cut back quite a bit on some of our abstractions. Now, these are known as sustainability reductions. And recently, Thames Water was told by the Environment Agency that the possible sustainability reductions in its area is around about 10% of its supply. In addition, we've got climate change. And we know that that means less rainfall, which means less flow in the rivers in summer, which probably go down maybe 30%. And the analysis that Thames Water have done is that will reduce their resources by about another 7%. Now, public water companies have a statutory duty to actually provide water to their customers. Now, the abstraction licenses under which they work were granted on a first-come, first-served basis and are generally in perpetuity. And other abstractors from the river are also in industry, cooling of power stations, and agriculture. So it's clear that with the reduction in water resources, etc., we're going to have to reduce the abstractions. So my question to you folks is, with the reduction in water resources available, whose licenses should be reduced, and how should the abstraction license system be changed? Let's go on now and look at the supply-demand balance. Now, where a company does not have a shortage of resources, then I would agree with Caspar that demand management is not an issue. But in the south and the east of this country, there is, over the next 25 years, there is a shortage of resources, so demand management is needed as well as new resources. And by demand management, we mean metering, metering with tariffs and incentives, we mean leakage, we mean things like water audits, we need more water-efficient appliances. Now, demand management is an essential tool for those sort of areas. It's been mainstream in government policy and for most of the water companies as well since about the 1990s. The question to my panel members and the you is, to what extent should water companies promote and achieve water efficiency? Now, taking as an instance of one of those is leakage. Now, the current leakage is something like 20% of the water that's put into supply just gets leaks out on the way to the customers. Now, in theory, the company's leakages are set on the economic level of leakage, but this does not include any value for the water itself. Many believe that it should do. To give you an idea of the variance, unit water company leakages vary from about 80 litres per property per day to 175 litres per property per day. So there's quite a big variance in the leakage. A recent UK water industry research report considers that in general 80 litres per property per day could be achieved with limited investment. Now, a question to you folks is, to what extent should companies lower leakage further? Looking at the international scene, in overseas countries, yes, agricultural extraction is something like 70% of the water that is abstracted. In many cases, these water resources are grossly over-extracted to the extent that the rivers and aquifers are not sustainable. North China Plain, the groundwater level there has already gone down to something like minus 90 metres, and it's dropping at a rate of about a metre per year. The Canadian Water Soft Path book says, and I quote, "To meet the food demands of the projected world population in 2050, will require close to all the fresh water that can presently be withdrawn. Thus, much of the water for nature will have to become from the expense of agriculture, which means that many people will have to starve to meet ecosystem protection goals." Interesting, provocative. Now, I'll ask you folks, do you agree that ecosystem goals are paramount for the future of the planet?
Chris had a whole bunch of questions there. Caspar, would you like to start off?
Yeah, I'm happy to make a couple of points. I think with regards to leakage, of course you can look at it from a demand management or a supply management point of view. I'm actually arguing for infrastructure. I'm arguing that actually we overhaul the infrastructure that the Victorians put in, which is what we're still relying on. And I'm actually sort of seeing that from a viewpoint of supply management. So the leakage thing, I agree with you entirely. I would actually try and get that down to 1% if it were up to me. But that means huge spending. You know, it actually means political will and taking it seriously. And that's part of the story, in the same way as building new reservoirs where we need them is part of the story. I would always put people first. I do think that, yes, we need to maintain ecosystems in certain circumstances, and we need to actually look at those things seriously when we just make decisions about things, but I would always put people first. I was a bit disappointed that David didn't draw out the points in his brilliant book, Sound of Thirst, because actually one of the main points that you make in that book is about universal provision, that actually it is possible to provide water to every person on the planet, and that's what we should be aiming for. So I was a little disappointed you didn't go down that road, because that's the road that I would go down.
All United Nations targets and so on until now have been about lessening non-access. It's a completely wrong mindset. If you have 10% of people in a urban area who don't have proper sanitation, their excrement pollutes the other 90%. So targets and targetism are fatal errors. The only target that matters is universal access. Compared to a lot of things like electricity and telecoms, soft drinks, and so on and so forth, universal access is extraordinarily cheap. My estimate is between $7 and $9 trillion would mean everybody in the world having a household tap of safe water, and everybody in the world would either have sewerage or a proper form of septic tank management, and all urban wastewater would be treated. It is astonishingly affordable, a fantastic recession buster, great job creator, and it also turns the entire way we look at water. You say, right, we have, and I do believe it is, a finite resource, but a renewable resource coming in one end, and instead of treating wastewater as a waste, we start to treat it as a resource. Wastewater is all about water, nutrients and energy, and it's high time we started extracting all that goodness that we put into it.
I think one of the things we need to remember here is there are huge inefficiencies in water use around the world. And if we come back to this idea of having water, food and energy interconnected, and the fact that 70% of water goes into agriculture, 30% of food around the world is wasted. 30%, pretty much, 30% in the developing world is lost in field because of lack of infrastructure and kind of proper agricultural planning. 30% in the developed world, or just below, is lost because we buy food at the supermarket, let it go off in the fridge and chuck it in the bin. Or the supermarket gets it, doesn't quite like the right standard and throws it away. I mean, one of the things I'd love to see when you get your supermarket receipt and it says at the bottom you got 200 club card points or nectar points or whatever it is, and by the way, if you spent £100, you probably wasted £26 of that because you're going to chuck it in the bin. No, seriously, because actually we need to think about these things in a much more connected way. And if I look at it from the demand side as a business, as it were, even though we've got, and we had this debate in the green room early on, even though we have extremely good engineers all over the world doing a brilliant job in terms of making very good, high-quality, enjoyable beer, it was only when we set ourselves a target of improving our water use per litre of beer by 25% between 2008 and 2015 that we really suddenly started to see the scale of the opportunity there. And there's a lot of money on the table for us as a business, reducing our operating costs through our water, and we've got a kind of bigger carbon target. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to, both as consumers and as companies, individual consumers and as companies, think much more efficiently about how we use resources without actually reducing any of the utility or satisfaction we get from consuming products, because there's so much waste in the system.
Right, I mean, coming back to Caspar, you say that water is going to run out. No, but water is finite, so you can't go on developing water resources. There is a finite limit for the amount that you can actually get. So I think you didn't take that on board in your analysis. Turning now to Kielder. Kielder was proposed back in, I think, 1974, because there was going to be a big growth in steel industry in the northeast of England. This enormous scheme provided a lot of water. In current day terms, it cost about £1 billion. At the time that it was completed, the water demand had not taken off, and the demand today is less than the demand was at the time of the public inquiry. So we've got a lovely £1 billion investment there, giving virtually no return at all. And that's one of the reasons why, if you're going to go for a reservoir, which takes 15 years or thereabouts from inception to commission, you need particularly robust water demand projections right through into the future. We come on now to the Thames Water proposals in 2006. I gave evidence at the 2006 public inquiry. That was into the desalination plant. And Thames got agreement to put in this 150 megalitre a day desal plant in Beckton, which is now, in fact, being commissioned and operating quite nicely. Well done, Thames. But then come forward to their proposals for the reservoir. Now, the first stage of their proposals at that time was a demand projection of whatever the number is up there. By the time they came to do the 2009 water resource plan, that demand projection had come down by 360 megalitres a day. So, and the reservoir was 300 megalitres a day. So that was a bit of a nonsense in many ways. They had grossly overestimated the demand projection.
You're saying kind of Kildare doesn't meet any demand or isn't needed up north, but yet we're hearing down south that we do have large areas of demand. The water resources there can't meet that. What's to stop us connecting the areas in which we do have water and moving it to the areas where we need it? So I mean, we're not talking kind of transporting water to the Sahara here. It's a relatively short distance. Even that £1 billion investment may be a bit of a short-sighted step in that it only kind of localised that resource in a very small area.
That is entirely what the Water Resources of the South East Group is currently looking at.
Oh, well, great, thanks. Before I go to the audience quickly, is there anything else anybody on the panel would like to pick up on?
So, yeah, Singapore is going for 2060 total self-sufficiency. Reason being, he's got much of its water comes from Malaysia, and it doesn't want Malaysia to be able to turn off the taps. And it has had that. I worked for the Public Utilities Board in Singapore for quite a number of years. So, yes, that's one of its main drivers. The way it's achieving that, and I was on its website last night, is very much with desalination plants and reuse plants. And the reuse plants are using reverse osmosis in them. So all of those water plants use considerable amounts of energy. So if you come around to the water-food energy nexus, in my view, desal and reverse osmosis, I think physically cannot get an awful lot more efficient, and they are contributing appreciably to use of energy and CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, that seems slightly contradictory because you were saying how great it was about the Thames desalination plant a moment ago.
I said it was working well.
Yeah, exactly. You did. Okay, yeah, I mean, just Kildare, I think you'd be very hard pushed to find anybody in the northeast who would agree that that's a resource that we aren't pleased that we've got, especially if it does attract new industries to the region, but in particular because we laugh at everyone else in the rest of the country every year when there are these drought warnings. I mean, you talk about small increments, but actually, if you're going to plan to build reservoirs, and you're talking about the London area, you don't want to be projecting 10 years in the future or 15 years into the future. You want to be thinking ahead. You know, the Victorians, they believed in their future. Bazalgette thought big because he thought, OK, we don't know what's going to happen to London, and he was right. You don't know what's going to happen to London. And in fact, one of the reasons the projection dropped so much is because the housing market collapsed, and therefore the projected 200,000 new homes aren't going to be built. But I would argue that actually that doesn't mean those 200,000 homes aren't needed, and that doesn't mean that the population of London isn't going to continue to grow, because it is. It's actually unrealistic the other way around. You know, the fact that there's an unwillingness to build houses or the infrastructure to support them is a real problem for society.
Chris asked about leakage. The existing regulatory regime by Ofwat is what's known as the economic level of leakage, which everyone rather dismisses. But it's based on the perfectly sensible assumption that to dig up every pipe that leaks within 24 hours of being told it leaks would be enormously disruptive and enormously expensive. So the issue of leakage is not to get leakage down to zero, but to get it down to a lesser level. And interestingly, in terms of nudge behavior, the argument for leakage reduction is actually on consumer perception. If you look at consumer attitudes in the Thames region when they were told there was a drought, one of the knee-jerk reactions was, why should we save water? Why should we shower? Why should we turn off our hoses? Why should we not wash our cars if Thames water is leaking 4 swimming pools each time we blink an eye? So one of the arguments for reducing leakage is that it's a quid pro quo to get for the demand management side for consumers. Lastly, on a totally different tack, a lot of the discussion has been on the clean water side of the bill, but the major pressures in London on Thames is on the dirty water side. The Thames Interceptor sewer, which Binnie is personally to some extent responsible, is going to add £80 a year to everyone's water bill. And that isn't the clean water side of the business, it's the sewerage side of the business.
In India, the women are putting their feet down, the mothers. If somebody wants to marry their daughter, they're coming up saying, no toilet, no bride. A bit of sort of Lysistrata coming up. Desalination, what do you do with the excess salt? I hope it doesn't go back in the sea and to kill the fish. I don't give a fig for the EU. They came out with a limit for pH, which was not measurable, according to the chairman of my Ofwat committee, who was a chemist. I've argued last week about building stopped in any areas of Britain, which is at risk of flood or is shortage of water, which means actually we need fewer people. If you're going to tax anything, I'd tax immigrants.
Actually, more a technical question. I was looking at the water statistics, and it seems quite a lot is used on power generation. Obviously, power stations do create a lot of heat. Why is it you can't build them at the coast and use salt water on that? And if you linked it up to a condenser, couldn't you actually combine power stations with desalination? I mean, presumably there's some reason you have to close them down and remove the salt now and again. But it would strike me as technically possible.
I'm a water consumer, and I recognise that my attitudes to water consumption don't make a lot of sense. They're quite confused. And I'm not involved in the water industry or the scientific exploration of it at all. And I would say that the debates here today have really not made much impact on ordinary people. And if it were to rain now, I think your quickest bonding with another member of the public would be to say, oh, that'll bring about another hosepipe ban. And that would be an instant connection. But there were two things that I want to reflect on. One is that we do have very confused attitudes, and that there isn't really a debate, I don't think, going on within the general public about this. And just secondly, bringing forward a thought from one of the previous sessions I was in, which was a crisis of compassion, and that is that delivering water to every household in the world doesn't necessarily mean that every human being gets access to it. There are often mediators between the water in the household and who gets to use it. A comment by a social worker I heard recently, when a woman was told she couldn't have the cleaning that she needed in her house. Nobody ever died of a dirty house. And we heard recently of the man in a hospital who had to call the police because he wasn't given water by the nurses. And thirdly, I'd like to say I see, people also as a resource and as an answer to this. And maybe we should think about moving around the resource of people rather than some of the structural changes. So maybe more of us should go and live in the northeast.
Population movement, it does rather remind me when this came up at the last general election, and I think it was one of the parties suggested that people should be moved to the northeast and the north, especially immigrants. I presume that they're going to have tattoos on their foreheads and so on, so it's a dodgy subject. But yeah, it's just one of those things that people go to where the money and the power is, and unfortunately the water doesn't. We have an existential problem here. I want to touch on the metering point and the leakage point. Yes, fixing all the pipes and so on, astronomically expensive, astronomical disruption. However, there are other ways of doing it. For example, real-time smart pressure management within the network to minimize leakage, using ways of remotely identifying where leaks are taking place and so on and so forth. So we're on this cusp of an era when water is starting to be, you might say there's a convergence between IT, mobile comms and water, and using all these things to manage it more effectively. And I do think that's going to have quite a big impact. The other side on that is making customers aware about leakage within the property, which does account for 30% of leakage. So there's quite a lot that can be done there. And funny enough, smart metering is a very early concept yet, but one of the beauties about smart metering, it tells you in real time you've got a leak. So it's early days, but there's quite a lot to be encouraged about on that side of the issue. On Singapore, yes, desal is terribly energy intensive. Wastewater recovery, less energy intensive. And in fact, we've already got trials in Germany where they are now they're generating 140% of the energy they're using through getting the energy out of the wastewater. And theoretically, it could be 700%. So there are encouraging moves in that direction again. If all goes well, that's one of the things to be encouraged about. We might be moving into 2 great decades of innovation in water, a new age, which is not going to solve the supply problem, but it's going to show that we can do clever things with demand and we can do clever things with a limited resource.
When we talk about innovation in demand, how does that attitude here affect how we look abroad to places where actually limiting demand kind of does nothing because supply just isn't there? So I mean, is there a correlation between how we treat water here and how we behave, treat it as a resource, and actually how that ends up, the politics of that affecting, say, the development of water resources in, say, the third world?
Some of the most heavy water users in the world are places like California and Australia, where that's domestic water users and users of irrigated water. Now, the simplest form of demand management and supply management is very simple. It's called the coil, it's called the pill, it's called the condom. Put those in, and we are now talking about sustainable water management. However, as we all know, those are completely politically unacceptable. We live in an era when politics is effectively about adolescents screaming at each other with microphones. You look at the moronic inferno of the US presidential election, for example. So what do we do with this? Yes, but there are some very interesting alignments. Some countries are starting to become water aware, and societies are starting to become water aware. I mean, traditional ways of dealing with water could be very water efficient. Ultimately, the biggest single linkage between water usage in industry, agriculture, and municipal usage is the price of water. Where people have to have some element of cross recovery, when water has a value, it gets valued. When water doesn't have a value, it doesn't get valued. That's the killer one.
In South Africa, where we make a lot of beer and do soft drinks, we pay something like $0.50 per metre cubed of water. And it's essentially an extraction, a treatment and a pumping cost. It's an engineering cost. The farmers that we buy our raw materials from, and bear in mind that if you one of our beers in South Africa takes roughly about 155 litres of water to make 1 litre of beer. And interestingly, beer is one of the more water efficient drinks. Coffee and wine and orange juice and many others take far more. And second, that about 4 of those litres are within the brewery, and almost entirely the rest is in agriculture. Some is rain-fed, but sometimes in scarce areas. Some is irrigated. So the vast majority of the water footprint of a beer in South Africa is in agriculture. And we're paying for the 4 litres that we use in our brewery, something like $0.50 for a metre cubed of water. The farmer's paying less than 2% of that for the same amount of water. Now, clearly there's slightly less treatment and cost and pumping cost, but there's no sense of the potential scarcity cost or integrated into the value of that resource, the scarcity, such that it would drive the most rational behaviour around the use of water. And that's after basic needs around water should have been met, because South Africa has quite a good basic law around basic access to water, even if there's some challenges around implementation. So the one thing I wanted to pick up was that value piece is very real. The second thing I wanted to say is around power stations and where you site them. Yes, that has a big impact on water use. There's nuclear power stations are all over the coast for a good reason. So where, for example, countries, particularly in the developing world, are investing in new power infrastructure. China puts in new power infrastructure equivalent to the UK's entire output every year. When people are thinking about that, actually thinking about the water resource first rather than as an afterthought to energy policy is actually critically important. But the good thing about many of those markets that are experiencing perhaps the sharper end of water scarcity and water risk than us is that that does transform the public debate, because I agree the public debate in the UK is rather moribund and tedious, but actually if you go to China, the water debate is quite lively. So I'm involved in an organisation called thirstforwater.org, which is about getting young people in China, starting out in China and eventually globally, engaged in water debates. And they have, hundreds of millions of people tweeting their stuff and going on Weibo and all that stuff, engaged in the debate, because people can see a very real impact in their daily lives.
Disturbing, but fairly predictable that it's gone into the discussion about population, and I find that very depressing, but not surprising at all. The more people, the better. I'm a humanist. I like your crisis of compassion point. That sort of goes along with the humanist view. The idea that we need fewer people is the most objectionable idea on the table. And this is one of the reasons why I don't really like to buy into this whole idea of limits, and in particular with regard to water, I just don't buy it. I do think that there are confused attitudes with water consumers. I also think that, because of the situation we live in, because we are developed, and because our water resources were developed, 150 years ago, it's sort of an invisible issue because people just expect it to come out of the tap, and so it's not a sexy issue like it is in a lot of other places who have only just got that or haven't got that, and that's something that you also talk about in your book, isn't it? And I think that's quite interesting. The water can be the invisible issue just simply because we do have access to it. But in some ways, that's a good thing. I mean, because it is good that we have that access. So the fact that it makes the audience smaller is not necessarily a bad thing. I did just want to point out something that I always think is quite interesting. I think most people don't recognise when you're talking about water pricing and these things. It's actually the poorest people in the world are the people who pay the most for water, and that's something that's counterintuitive. Yeah, most per unit. Yeah, that's true. And I think that's something to bear in mind. I mean, we are very lucky. We actually pay very little for water, we're very privileged with that. I like the no toilet, no bride idea as well.
I'd like to take up one thing about Caspar, because I think one of the things he talks about Kielder and what a great advantage it is to the northeast. Yes, that's fine, but the northeast isn't actually paying for Kielder. It cost about £1 billion, but there's virtually very, very little of that is being repaid by the citizens of the northeast. The country, I believe there is a limit to the amount of money that we are able to generate to invest in this country, and we've got to be careful what we do with it. So we've got to cut our cloth carefully and not just go on building all the things we might like to build rather than the things that we need to build. The other point I think I'd like to take up is limits. Caspar said, hey guys, I don't believe in any limits. We should procreate as much as everyone wanted to, and we must expand, etc. Now, I have been told, and I don't know the figures, but we're already using up the resources of 1.5 planets with the population that we've got already. And if we follow Caspar's analysis, hey guys, we're up to 2 planets, we're up to 3 planets, and at some stage we'll get to the stage when the planet will say, forget it guys, and we will no longer be able to sustain, and then there'll be a real crash like the dinosaurs.
Doesn't what a resource is kind of change? So The fact you're talking about desalination, 200 years ago, the idea of commercially desalinating and distributing water would be unthinkable. So that changes the resource. If we carry, I guess I agree. If we carry on using things in the same way, that creates problems. But that's not what happens. And I think within the water debate, that's not what happens either. I think you've all probably kind of agreed with this, that we need to kind of explore all these kinds of options, demand side and the supply. And for me, desalination seems like a really kind of obvious answer to a lot of these problems. I was interested in what you were saying, David, about the population, so the condoms and stuff. So but how do you think water ties into that development in that way? So obviously what we know is that kind of more prosperous countries tend to have much lower birth rates, and it's not simple as just saying let's get condoms out there and stop people using water by having babies. Maybe we stop water birth from it. That'd be a start. But what kind of role does water have to play in development? How does a country go about getting this clean water? Can it just happen before development, I guess?
Water has a fascinating role in development. I did a piece of research where I compared GDP per capita development in South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, India from 1960 to today. And they're all surprisingly similar in 1960. And then I compared it to the development of household water, household sewerage, and secondary wastewater treatment. And the interesting thing is to see how in Singapore, getting a world-class wastewater and water infrastructure in early boosted economic development. One of the reasons being, of course, it's a part of civil society. It's a sign of a civilized society. Skara Brae, 5,500 years ago, had universal household sewerage in the Orkney Islands. The Harappan civilization in the Upper Indus Valley in Pakistan had household sewerage 4,000 years ago. Household sewerage in Pakistan is very much the exception today. So civilizations are often characterized by their access to sewerage and to water, and more recently to wastewater treatment. And it's a sign of civil society and a sign of economic and political and social development, because it shows that a government is existing to create a civilized society rather than to line its pockets or to push down power. And that point about water being most expensive for the poor runs right to the heart of this, because where people have to rely on vendors, they can pay up to 250 times as much for water of poor quality. The rich, they get their water in a tap. They are also, of course, plugged into the power networks with the municipalities and the governments. The poor, they don't own their property, they don't vote, they don't get water. Civilized societies have universal access. And so, yes, I think it's, in a sense, whether the two are inextricably or causally linked is open to debate. But it's a sort of thing a developing and a developed society ought to have. And it's a good metaphor, in a way, for development.
I wanted to come on the desalination piece. I was involved in a piece of work in 2009 called the Water Resources Group. It's now part of the International Finance Corporation, and it was a big piece of work done by different UN agencies, a number of companies like mine. The kind of work was essentially done by the consultants McKinsey. And one of the things they looked at was what the lowest cost option was in different parts of the world, with all solutions on the table, demand and supply solutions, to meeting the water gap. And of course that water gap by 2030 is very different in different places. China, India quite high, South Africa kind of in the middle, other countries much less of a problem. But 40% on aggregate overall. And almost in every single case, when you look at the abatement curves, the most expensive way to meet the water gap is by desalination. Now, in some ways, this is, I think, in this festival, kind of the engineering room. And one of the things that engineers in my operation, in my business, like are quite distinct, manageable, straightforward solutions that involve technology they understand and clear ways of managing the process. And desal is one of those, because it's very straightforward, it's very clear, the technologies are there, they're getting more efficient. Why isn't that the solution? There are, and it may be a solution, desal may be the solution, particularly in coastal areas, particularly for high-value uses of water. But if you look at the total water gap that we have across different countries around the world, actually a lot of it is in areas where to get desal water there would be incredibly expensive and inefficient. And actually there are many other, much cheaper solutions involved around the way farmers use water, the way individuals use water, the way you can capture rainwater and develop much more sensible supply-side measures that will be far cheaper than desal. But they're a bit more complex from a social perspective. They're more difficult to engineer. Many more groups need to be involved. And that's where a lot of the dialogue and partnership discussion that's been going on between NGOs, business, government, and local community groups needs to grow dramatically.
Internationally, it's agriculture that abstracts 70% of the water that's used. If we can make agriculture more efficient, or we can only irrigate crops of sufficient value to make it worthwhile, we can free up an awful lot of water resources. And I believe that internationally, in many of the countries, that is the way to go, rather than to go for desalination.
Yeah, I agree. More efficiency is always good, and actually things like drip irrigation and so on. There's some great technologies out there. It doesn't undermine, some of these central points about general ways of viewing things. And I do want to come back to this thing about limits because I think it's really important. Something that you pointed out, Craig. Resources are things that you're using in a particular way. Coal wasn't a resource until 150 years ago. Oil wasn't until 100 years ago. Silicon wasn't a resource. All these things become resources. We don't know what the resource of tomorrow will be. So when we talk about limits to resources, it's always in the framework of where we are now. And that's about limits to the imagination. It's not about limits to physical things at all. And that's one of the reasons why I reject it as a way of looking at the world. But with water in particular, you say the amount of water is limited, but we can reuse it and reuse it and reuse it. And you also know that only 1% of the water on the Earth is actually not salt water that we use currently. And that might change. We can change that. There are all sorts of things we can do. We don't know how we're going to deal with water resources in the future, just as we don't know how we're going to deal with other resources. We want to take the best technologies we have now and use those, but we also don't want to close down our imagination. And, I'll stop there.
I just wondered what the role is of consultants in all of this, because when I hear the word McKinsey's, I get worried that basically, not to be too cynical, it's in their interest to almost stoke up sort of anxiety over limits and stuff like this, because, they're going to come in and be able to offer the solution. And I just wondered, it's a bit glib, I know, but I just wonder if Bazalgette, with his wonderful clean and brown water solution back in the 1850s, I just wonder if he would have been allowed to get anywhere if consultants have been saying basically, everything's got a price, blah blah blah, and I'm sure no one knows it, but how long did it actually take for Bazalgette's project to actually get paid off? And sometimes to me it seems like I'm not particularly going for private or public, but there are certain basic things where to me it seems like they should be done, at least orchestrated by the government, and we shouldn't necessarily be relying on sort of financial shenanigans and stuff like this to get something done. So if anyone does know how long it took for Bazalgette's project to get paid off, I'll be interested to know.
I've been in the US for a number of years, and I've just come back to England, so it's pretty shocking to come back to what is obviously a very damp and rainy country, and to learn that there are problems with water shortages. And when you compare Britain to places around the world, obviously millions of people around the world live in deserts, in cities and the rest of it. So, it strikes me that surely I haven't looked at this, but surely the problem must be in the realm of imagination and infrastructure rather than the environment in which we live. So I applaud the people who are talking about that we do need to think about imagination, use our imaginations to make sure we get a better water supply. And a couple of things strike me. One is we haven't talked about water in the air. Surely taking water from the air has got to be a possibility. The other one is that, again, I haven't looked at this, but what potential is there for moving water larger distances? Because obviously there are plenty of places around the world that have an oversupply of water, and then places that have an undersupply. And again, I know in the US that, I mean, they've just had a pretty serious drought in the central and the southern parts of the country. But, you know, then the other plants like the northwest and the northeast, again, have got an oversupply of water. They seem to not have a problem, well, not usually have a problem building pipelines to pipe oil from one end of the continent to the other. But I don't know why we're not building pipelines for water to span, you know, over thousands of miles. Is that a possibility? Perhaps the panel could comment on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to echo your point about the rainy Britain and the drought. I have a lot of friends from Australia at the moment, and they were highly amused by the drought and the hosepipe ban in Britain, especially if they were here for any of our summer. Well, two brief points really. One of them is to say that yes, people have always worried about limits and shortage of resources. And there's a quote which I wish I could remember verbatim. It's very pithy about our teeming numbers being evidence that our population is burdensome upon the world. That was written in 210 AD, when the entire human population of the world was about 250 million people. And we have always found solutions. Well, we've always found coal, and then when coal was actually to replace peak wood, hilariously, when wood became too expensive a resource to burn, we went on to coal, then we went on to oil, and so on. So yeah, we're able to find new solutions. I'd like to come back to Caspar's point that water is infinitely recyclable. You can reuse the same water. It's not like something like a rare earth metal where that gets scarce and you have to actually find a completely new way of doing something. I find it very interesting that the idea there are natural limits on things, and the idea that we only have a limited amount of money to spend on infrastructure things seem to tie in very, very nicely with each other, and somehow linked together. And finally, although I love Bazalgette to bits, and he was obviously brilliant and had a great moustache and everything, but isn't it a pity that he is cited in every single engineering debate? I mean, surely somebody since then has done something great about infrastructure, and if not, then it's about time.
Thank you. Actually, just to add on that, and I was interested, Andy, the way you were talking about water footprints, and I think the discussion about wastewater. And I think you also hinted at it, but doesn't what a water footprint is my understanding, change when we change how we deal with, say, wastewater, and how we manage the resource there? So, I mean, yeah. So how I'm thinking is, if you use 200 litres to make 1 litre of beer, yep, that 200 litres just doesn't disappear, or not doesn't necessarily have to disappear. I mean, isn't that a way? So, I mean, how useful is a footprint when we're talking about these and trying to deal with the issues?
Sure. I mean, the footprint methodology is fairly well established. You can go online and dissect it at waterfootprint.org, and lots of companies and all sorts of academics around the world have kind of challenged it and tested it, and joined in the debate. I mean, I think that the philosophy of it is that it's supposed to capture the footprint within a particular water system. And so, for example, if you do include, for example, in there an element of wastewater, if you're actually degrading water through the process of doing your industrial process or whatever it is, that is captured in there. But when I started talking about earlier on, we have to be very careful water footprints, because they are really good for raising awareness. People are generally shocked by understanding their water footprint, but actually they're only so useful for taking, for example, a consumption decision. It's not particularly useful for you to compare 2 beers and say, this water footprint's this and this water footprint's this, because they could have been, the barley used to make them could have been grown in completely different places. It's much more useful for a company like me to follow the chain and use the footprint to understand which particular agricultural area is under stress, and then get into detail. So you've got to be careful with them. I mean, I wanted to pick up 2 things if I can. One is around the limits piece, because I don't think that limits and imagination are 2 opposing things. I think they're very interactive, and that's a very healthy thing. And water limits are real. Look at the Times of India last week. There's a number of industrial parks that have been cut off in various parts of India from water supply because the monsoon has been lower than people expected. In the big scheme of things, that water is recyclable and everything else, but it can cause immense disruption if it's not in the place it's expected to be at the time it's expected to be there. And so the question is much more around how do we use our awareness of limits, which are as a result of growing demands principally, How do we use that awareness to drive creativity and innovation? And sometimes the solutions around water can be really innovative. So let me give you an example from Colombia, where we brew beer near Bogota, and we saw the price of our water as a business growing rapidly. And it turned out it was because the water utility had to pay more to take soil out of the incoming water source. And that was because of the deforestation from the Paramo, the kind of around Bogota. So what we ended up with, working with an NGO called the Nature Conservancy, was a beer company, us, and a range of other companies, paying farmers who are farming dairy cattle on deforested land to manage their land differently, to not have their cattle on the steepest slopes, to put back in some of the forest so that they don't get all the soil running into the river, and it arrested the price increase for our water. Now, it's not a technical innovation, it's a system innovation, but we need people to think at that systems level and think very creatively, and it's often the limits or the particular change in circumstance that drives that innovation.
Can we move water around? Yes, and we do. There's a thing called the Ely's to Essex scheme, which takes water from Norfolk near King's Lynn and brings it down to Essex and provides water to east of London. So we're already transferring water from catchment to catchment. It's best done when you can take water from near a tidal limit so that it doesn't have any detrimental effect, and what happens there. There's also a proposal to transfer water from the lower part of the Severn near Gloucester to the Upper Thames that's an alternative to the reservoir. So you're taking water which would otherwise go into the tidal part into the upper parts of the Thames and then regulate it down the river to London. I mean, the critical thing there is water quality and mixing of the qualities and how far you can actually have to move down the river in order to be able to accept water which isn't quite the same quality. In China, they're putting in 1,000-kilometre water conveyor, a massive great canal to take water from the Yangtze up to Beijing, because there's an enormous shortage up at the top of that. Reuse, yes, there are a number of reuse schemes around the world. The one that is probably the best is Windhoek in Namibia, very dry area, and there for quite something like 20 or 30 years, they have recycled directly the sewage effluent into the inlet of the water treatment works. About 10 years ago, they did actually increase the level of treatment. In fact, so it's now got ultrafiltration on it. But previously, it just got ordinary water treatment works. And that's worked satisfactorily for 30 years. And Thames Water, one of the alternatives they're looking at for the future, is to take effluent from the Deepham sewage treatment works and treat that more, put it in the reservoirs in the Lee Valley, and use that as part of London supply. Again, they're thinking they're quite likely they might have to go to reverse osmosis in order to make sure that the impurities are taken out. And they're studying this at the moment. Chairman, thank you.
The finance one and so on. Very interesting. British Medical Journal in 2007 asked, what is the greatest medical advance in the last 150 years? And they said sewerage. How was it paid for in Britain? By bonds. In fact, it was municipalities took out bonds, knowing that they had a cash flow coming in to finance them. They got a cheap source of finance, and it meant that they were able to afford to build them. So water and wastewater is a fabulously good investment in terms of not just the fact that it's a low-risk investment, but it's in terms of the returns, not just the financial returns, but the human and the environmental returns, which in fact vastly outweigh the financial returns. So I am a consultant, but not a McKinsey type. Yes, good old-fashioned, unsexy bond finance is the way forward. And I wish people would realise that water isn't an unsexy subject. It's a great thing to do business in that sense. Moving water. Now, it was claimed that to move water from Scotland to sort out the southeast of England's problems would cost £11 billion, which would something in the region of £80 to £120 to every customer's bill. Now, I'm always a little bit cautious about these schemes. It's like when they quoted £4 billion for the new London sewer scheme. Funny enough, if you back calculate that onto the bill, what you get is Thames Water's rate of return on new assets. And sometimes it's cart before the horse and so on and so forth. There, yes, there is some financial monkey business taking place. Really what matters is what it costs to do and how you finance it, rather than looking at it in terms of cold returns. So water moving, again, energy costs, infrastructure costs, financial costs. As a last resort, yes, but we do live in a finite world. As I say, of course, it's not that the whole world is in shortage, some is in plenty. What is it about South East England which is so odd? It's simply the sheer population density of South East England when you compare it to America or Australia. And that's a unique thing. That's why it's such a problematic place. As I say, 41% of water which hits the ground in South East England ends up in the pipes. So that's a pretty intensive level of abstraction. And finally, on footprints, there's another way I'd like to look at this, is making water work. Now, what I mean by that is there's some lovely work done by the United Nations on comparing the amount of water abstracted by industry to industrial value added. They found, for example, in some of the countries in the old former Soviet Union, they were generating between 3 and 10 cents of value for every cubic meter of water they took out. In Denmark, they were generating $120 of value for every cubic meter. And it's a very rough, very early thing, this. And of course, you can't compare things to things, because one might be for vast obsolete steelworks, the others might be shinier, super value-added technology. But again, it does show, water does have a value. And maybe one of the things we should be doing is saying, right, how much money can we get out of water? How much good can we get out of water? Early days, but again, it's an interesting little tool.
Yeah, I mean, on moving water, yes, it's doable, and in some circumstances it makes sense, but it's actually quite often not the best solution, which is one of the reasons why I would actually argue for the Abingdon Reservoir as a long-term solution for the area, because that makes more sense than moving water about. I mean, I know that when there was a drought in Yorkshire in the 90s, they were actually taking water from Kielder in lorries down to Yorkshire. Now, again, that was very sensible. It was a short-term solution. It solved an immediate problem, but it was a very inefficient way of going about things. So yes, moving water, not necessarily against the idea, but I think that there's often better solutions. With Bazalgette, yeah, sorry, I always come back to Bazalgette, but Bazalgette, I mean, he is one of my heroes, but there really isn't anyone who's done anything quite that scale. I suppose there's the London Underground, quite an interesting example. Perhaps I should pick up an example on that for next time, just to have a different hero on the table. But of course, Bazalgette's the waterman, and nobody's ever done anything comparable in that he completely revolutionised the way that we deal with water worldwide. I mean, that's a one-off. No, you can't do that twice. So yes, I'm afraid Bazalgette's going to stay around for a while. How long did it take to pay for itself? Yeah, it's impossible to say, because actually, when you just think about those 25,000 people who died of cholera in 2 epidemics in the space of 3 years, well, how do you price that? Because you don't know how many cholera epidemics there would have been if they hadn't put that system in. So how you put a price on it, I really don't know. I would say it probably paid for itself in the first 5 years.
There's a really interesting piece of work that WLF published in Marks & Spencer last year, all about the fact that even though growing flowers in Kenya uses a huge amount of water to ship them to the UK to meet your Valentine's needs or whatever, actually is the most efficient way of using that resource to deliver value to communities there. So take a look at that. Second, the water, food, energy nexus. They're all connected, and we need to consider them together all the time.
When we learn to value water properly, we'll get value out of it. Universal access, universal high-quality services where and whenever possible, where people are allowed to appreciate its value and people are allowed to pay for it. Farmers, municipalities and industry. And that's the way to sustain the water cycle.
Water resources are finite. Many areas are water short. And there one needs to both use demand management as well as consider new water resources.
Thank you, Chris. Can we thank our panel, please?